I'm going to launch off of a theme that I started 2 years ago, and that is looking at scaling the circular economy with platforms. And 2 years ago, I introduced this distinction that I think we need to think about more deeply, which is a lot of the research and work and our understanding of the platform economy is based on what you might call linear platforms. These are platforms that engage and sell and do interactions with the sale of new products. But there's an emerging space that is incredibly important given trends in the world, which is we can't just throw everything out and put them in landfills. We need to think about how to create a more circular economy. And it turns out there's actually a ton of interesting things that are happening in this space. And what I'm going to do is drill down into one area, which is around electronics, and make the argument that every company in the world needs to have a platform strategy. You can't run a modern corporation today without digital assets. And this is obviously software gets a ton of attention, but there's a whole set of hardware. People think of cloud computing as being this ethereal thing, but there's actually physical data centers that need to be built. There's cabling that happens all over the world. So there's a bunch of physical infrastructure. And I've just listed a few of the things here that's involved. Obviously, everybody gets laptops. Then you also have servers, workstations. You got printers, scanners, monitors, and whatnot. And each of these has a certain life cycle to them. And companies have policies related to how long these things are put in service before they're refreshed. So laptops can be between 2 and 5 years, and then they get refreshed. The question then becomes what happens to those assets after they're refreshed. Everybody focuses on the new stuff, but there's a ton of stuff that needs to be dealt with. So I did a little estimate taking the Forbes Global 2000 just to get a sense of scale, like how many assets are out there. And of course, different industries deploy electronics at different rates. And so obviously the financial institutions, almost every employee gets a laptop. Other sectors don't get as many. But anyway, if you take those global 2000, estimate that at any one time these companies are deploying about 55 million laptops to their employees. And this is just the top 2,000 companies. As we know, there are millions of companies around the world. What often isn't thought about is what are the mining requirements to actually make those laptops. And I'm not going to run through all these numbers, but it is millions of tons of ore that has to be mined to actually create them. And so a lot of these are very precious, rare earth metals and whatnot, and there's a huge amount that is required. And I'm just talking about laptops. If you look at the full array of electronic equipment, it is huge. What's really interesting is to think about what I call the circularity delta, which is the difference between what a company spends on IT and what it recovers at end of life. And this is often ignored, and so companies are only, like if they spend $1 million, they may be only recovering $100,000, so that here, the circularity delta would be 90%. So the really question is how do we shrink that delta and get more recovery from the assets that are being deployed? We estimated of those 55 million laptops, companies are leaving on the table between $3 and $4 billion collectively. So there's a lot of value in these assets, but the companies aren't actually capturing them. So then the question becomes, how do you do that? And that gets you into this world of what they call reverse logistics. I know MIT's got actually fabulous programs on forward logistics, but there's a big gap. They don't spend a lot of time looking at reverse logistics, which is how do you get this stuff back? And there's actually a company here that specializes in this called OnePack, and they work with companies to how do you do that? And then as we move into this world of remote workers, it's getting even more complicated because they're spread out all over the place. So you need asset recovery. You need circular operations, which is sorting them. Some of this stuff is in really good condition, other of it is in terrible condition. So how do you decide, what the value proposition is and where does it go? And that's where you get into what they call value generation. And that brings us to platforms, because platforms are the engines for how you capture value from these assets. And there's a bunch of things that are involved, which is, platforms are really good at efficient matching, reducing transaction costs, creating value by adding value-added services, like logistics. And then establishing an ecosystem of complements, like how do you repair this stuff and who does that? So those become the complements to the platform. And then finally, merchandising. We know that merchandising is super important for first sale. There's whole careers built on this, but you have to merchandise used stuff as well. And that's an area that needs a lot more attention. So when I've been digging into this space, I've identified 5 different ways that platforms can help in this re-commerce space. I'm not going to run through all of these because I have a very, very short amount of time, but I've got a panel later today in which we're going to speak with a couple of different companies that are involved in different aspects of the different models. But basically, you can build your own and control that. You can white label a solution, or you can outsource it. There are companies now that are involved in what we call resale as a service. And then you can also have mission-driven platforms. There are platforms out there that actually have built networks of charities, and they will help match your assets with a charity that can use those assets, and you can recover tax benefits from doing that. I've been building a database of re-commerce platforms, and this is just a small sampling, but I think it gives you an idea of the scope of these resale marketplaces that exist around the world. Some of them are very large, like Amazon Resale and eBay Refurbished, and others are really niche. They do nothing but sell laptops or phones or something like that. So super interesting space and a lot of activity. The other thing that's interesting is what is the difference between a linear platform and a circular platform? And one of the things I've discovered is there's some companies that have built multi-platform strategies. They don't have one platform. They've got 3 or more. There's a company called Return Pro that specializes in returns. And they have kind of their high-end stuff, their VIP outlet. Then they have Go Wholesale, which is kind of the intermediate. And then they have liquidation. And these are all different mechanisms. Some of them are price listing, fixed price. Some of these are auctions that are timed, and you have to buy right then at that moment. So different mechanisms for reselling, which is pretty interesting. And then they have integrations with 20 other platforms. So this is a really interesting example of a multi-platform strategy. So going back to this earlier question of why every company needs a platform strategy, you have all of these assets. And I think electronics is just one example. There are many, many other products that companies have to run their operations or engage with their customers. So thinking about how do you develop a program, a roadmap to actually build a platform strategy that will help you with re-commerce and engage in what we call the circular economy. And so when you hear about the circular economy, there's this idea that you have to do it yourself, right? You've got to go, become circular. You basically take back the product that you sold from your customer and figure out ways to reuse that. But I think that's a very narrow way and probably not very economically efficient to do. So really pushing this idea of going circular together, how do you do that? You form platforms and engage in the re-commerce community. And there are tons of advantages to that. One is, as I mentioned, lower transaction costs. You can expand the pool of buyers and sellers. You can create network effects, right? And we need to scale the circular economy. So how do we get that flywheel working to benefit circular transactions? And it's easier to grow communities, and then you have your complements and whatnot. So there's tons of advantages to leveraging platforms and deploy them in this space. So with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker. So thank you very much. Ready?